The wind came low across the plains, carrying with it the dry scent of sage and sorrow. Beneath the vast pale sky, the town of Red Hollow lay still as bone, its dirt streets worn by hooves and hunger. Along the edge of the square, a woman stood alone, her hands clasped tight against the frayed hem of her shawl. Her face, though still young, bore the hollow calm of one who had forgotten the sound of laughter. The townsfolk gathered like buzzards, their murmurs dry as straw, their eyes quick with pity or judgment. It was hard to tell the difference. Her husband had been buried 3 weeks past, lowered into the cold earth behind the church. No one spoke his name anymore. Debts had a way of drowning the dead. The house they'd shared was gone, the fields stripped bare. All that remained was her body, her silence, and a ledger scrawled with numbers she could never pay. So the auctioneer stood beside her now, his voice cracking across the square like a whip, calling out the worth of a woman left behind. $1, someone called, more jest than mercy. Another voice rose. 2. Then came a pause, long as judgment, and a third voice, low, steady, unhurried, spoke from the back. 3, he said. I'll take her. She turned, slow and uncertain, and saw him broad-shouldered, sunburnt, a man who carried the dust like a second skin. His eyes were not cruel. That alone felt strange enough to stir something faint inside her chest, a flicker she did not trust. He stepped forward, handed the auctioneer the coins, 3 dull rounds of copper, and said, with a voice that carried no pride, "She's mine." The word rang through her like a hammer on glass. The crowd dispersed soon after. No one spoke to her, nor to him. He offered his hand, but she did not take it. They walked in silence through the empty street, past the shuttered saloon and the leaning church. The sun slipped lower, bleeding red across the sky, and the land stretched out before them, lonely, endless, unforgiving. She followed because there was nowhere else to go. His name was Caleb Holt, a rancher, though the land he kept was more stone than soil. He said little, only that she would have a place there, food, shelter, work. No promises beyond that. She nodded, though her throat ached to speak, to ask what he wanted of her, why he had chosen to claim what others mocked. But the words stayed buried, the way hope does when the ground is cold. That night, they reached the ranch, a house, weathered to gray, fenced by wind and silence. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows on the floor. He gave her a room with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out upon the barren fields. She sat there for a long while, her shawl wrapped tight, listening to the coyotes cry. It was a sound like mourning, like something lost calling to what remained. Sleep did not come easy. The bed creaked with every breath, and the memory of the auction clung to her like dust. She thought of her husband's grave, of the promises they'd whispered beneath younger skies. She thought of the 3 coins exchanged for her name, and she wondered if this, too, was a kind of death one, where the body walked, but the heart lay still. Yet in the silence, a faint warmth lingered, the memory of that man's voice when he'd spoken the word mine. Not greedy, not cruel, just certain, as though he'd seen something worth saving. By dawn, she rose and stepped outside. The air was sharp with frost, the earth hard beneath her boots. In the east, the sky burned gold. Caleb was already in the yard, saddling a horse, his movements steady, deliberate. He glanced up when she approached, offered a nod. No words, but something in his gaze, steady, patient, felt like the first crack in a long winter. She did not know what waited ahead, only that she would work and breathe and stand beneath this wide, indifferent sky until the ache in her chest found somewhere to rest. Perhaps that was all a soul could ask for on this side of sorrow. The days bled together at first, marked only by the rise and fall of the sun and the work that lay between. She rose before dawn, her body stiff from years of grief and hunger, and set her hands to whatever task Caleb laid before her, hauling water from the well, gathering kindling, mending the torn seams of old shirts. Her fingers blistered, her back ached, but she welcomed the pain. Pain meant the hours had shape, and shape kept the emptiness from swallowing her whole. Caleb was a man of silence. He worked with the same deliberate rhythm each day, tending to the cattle that scraped life from the brittle grass, mending fences that the wind tore down as quick as he built them. He did not speak unless there was need, and when he did, his words came plain and solid, like stones placed on a path. Yet she noticed the quiet kindness hidden in his stillness, the way he poured her coffee first, though he never said why, or the way he left the easier chores for her, pretending it was chance. At night, the silence stretched long across the little house. She sat by the fire, needle in hand, patching a pair of worn gloves. Caleb sat across from her, whittling wood into small, shapeless figures he never named. Outside, the coyotes sang again, and sometimes she thought their voices carried the sound of her own loneliness. But every now and then, when the fire cracked, she caught him glancing at her, as though searching for something not yet spoken. When sleep came, so did memories. She saw her husband's face, the laughter that once filled their cabin, the hollow eyes that lingered in his last days, when the drought had withered the crops and debt collectors darkened the door. She remembered his hand slipping from hers as the fever took him, and the sound of the shovel striking earth above his coffin. Waking from those dreams was like surfacing from deep water, airless, raw, trembling. Yet each time she rose from her narrow bed, the ranch was still there, the land vast and merciless, and Caleb already at work. And so she kept moving, step after step, breath after breath. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned black, and the wind howled like a beast let loose. Rain lashed the earth, flooding the yard, rattling the shutters. She ran to hold them fast, her shawl clutched tight against her shoulders. Caleb was out, with the cattle, driving them into shelter. She watched from the doorway as he battled the storm, his figure bent against the wind, lightning cutting him into stark silhouette. Fear tightened her chest. For reasons she could not name, she prayed he would return. He stumbled back, soaked through. Mud streaked across his face. She rushed forward without thought, pressing a dry cloth into his hands. He looked at her then, his eyes shadowed with weariness but lit with something soft, gratitude perhaps, or surprise that someone cared whether he lived or drowned. Their hands brushed, calloused against calloused, and the jolt of it lingered like fire under her skin. After that night, something shifted. Not much a longer glance, a wordless nod, the faintest curve of a smile when he saw her coax life back into the little patch of garden behind the house. She found herself speaking more, small words at first about the weather, the cattle, the way the earth smelled after rain. And, though his answers were spare, she heard warmth in them, a low hum of humanity she had not felt since before the grave. Still, doubts stalked her. At times she wondered if she was no more than labor to him, another set of hands to keep the ranch from falling to ruin. She wondered if his claim mine had been born of loneliness, or pity, or some bargain he had struck with himself. Yet when she saw him kneel in the field at dusk, running his hand through the brittle grass as though it might remember how to grow, she sensed there were sorrows in him too, sorrows buried deep, hidden from the world. She began to think that perhaps she was not the only ghost in that house. Spring crept across the plains like a hesitant promise, soft green blades breaking through the gray soil, the air tinged with the scent of thawing earth. With it came small changes, almost too fragile to name. The woman Mara, though no one had spoken her name aloud in months, found herself humming beneath her breath as she hung linens on the line. The wind tugged at her hair, the sun warmed her hands, and for the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel like a sentence. Caleb noticed, though he said nothing. He watched her from the porch as she worked, her movements careful and sure. She moved differently now, not like someone waiting to vanish, but like one who had begun to belong. He felt it too, though the feeling sat uneasy in him, a weight he did not know how to carry. He had lived alone too long. His words rusted, his heart fenced off like the far fields no plow dared touch. Still, each evening he found himself drawn to her quiet presence. They shared supper by lamplight, steam rising from bowls of stew she had learned to stretch from so little. Afterward, they would sit in the stillness, the sound of the wind threading through the eaves. Sometimes he spoke about the land, about the father who'd built this house and died before the harvest failed, about the brother who'd gone north and never returned. She listened with her eyes lowered, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, and though he could not read her thoughts, he felt her listening like sunlight breaking through cloud. In return, she began to offer pieces of her own past her childhood near the river, the wildflowers she used to gather, the husband whose dreams had withered with the crops. She spoke of burying him with her own hands when no one came to help. Caleb did not look away. He let her voice falter and fall, then quietly said, "You're still standing." It was not comfort, but truth, and truth was what she needed. Days folded into weeks. The work bound them together, wordless and steady. They rode out to mend fences, dug a new well when the old one ran dry. He showed her how to saddle a horse, how to find water by the color of the grass. She learned quick, her palms toughening, her back growing strong. At night, when exhaustion pressed her down, she dreamed not of graves, but of wide skies and running water. Yet beneath the growing ease between them, a current of unease lingered, something unspoken that waited in the shadows. The town still whispered. Some said she'd been bought cheap, others that Caleb had taken a broken woman for pity's sake. Each time she rode in for supplies, she felt the eyes upon her, the half-hidden smirks. Once, she overheard a woman at the mercantile murmur, $3 buys a ghost, not a wife. The words burned through her chest. That night, she said nothing, but her silence was brittle as ice. Caleb noticed. Over supper, he asked, "Someone hurt you?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Just words." He nodded slowly. "Words cut deep, sometimes deeper than a blade, but they don't know you." Her voice broke quiet and small. "Do you?" He met her eyes, then steady, dark, unflinching. "I'm learning." The honesty in it stole her breath. No man had ever said such a thing to her, not as a promise, but as a plain truth. She nodded once and looked away, though her throat ached with something like gratitude. Still, that night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the past pressing heavy on her chest. She feared she was nothing more than a burden, a reminder of loss he hadn't chosen. She wondered if love could grow from a bargain struck in shame. Outside, the wind sighed through the grass, and she thought of the 3 coins that had sealed her fate. Once, they had felt like chains. Now, she wondered if they had been seeds instead, tiny, unremarkable things that might yet bloom into something living. But spring, like mercy, was a fragile thing. And even the gentlest green could be crushed beneath the boot of a world that did not forgive easily. Summer came hard and bright, burning the plains into gold and dust. The heat pressed down like judgment, drawing sweat from the earth and from the bodies that worked it. Mara rose each dawn to the hum of cicadas, her dress clinging to her skin, her hands rough and strong. The ranch no longer felt like a stranger's land. She knew its moods now, the way the soil cracked after long days without rain. The scent of sage that rose when the wind turned east, the slow curve of the hills that held the light like a cupped hand. Caleb had begun to speak more, not in long strings of words, but in the steady sharing of a man unlearning solitude. He told her of his mother, who died giving birth to a child that never drew breath, of the years he spent chasing cattle across land that never seemed to belong to anyone, of the silence that had filled his house before she came. He never said the word lonely, but Mara heard it in every pause, every sigh that slipped through his teeth at dusk. In return, she spoke of the small joys. She remembered a ribbon from her girlhood, a song her mother used to hum, the taste of cold water drawn from the well at dusk. She never spoke much of her late husband. The wound was too old to bleed, but too deep to close. Sometimes, when the light hit her wedding band, she thought of taking it off, but her fingers could not bear the emptiness that would remain. Their closeness grew not in declarations, but in gestures, the way he set aside a ripe peach for her when the traders passed through town, the way she mended his torn shirts with careful hands, the quiet laughter that sometimes rose between them when a calf stumbled over its own legs. Life was still hard, the work unending, but the silence between them had softened, filled with something that might one day become trust. Yet trust is a fragile seed, and storms come without warning. One morning, a rider appeared on the horizon, a figure dressed in dark cloth, hat pulled low, horse slick with sweat. Mara stood at the fence line as the stranger approached, a coil of unease tightening in her belly. Caleb stepped out from the barn, his shoulders stiffening. The man dismounted, his boots striking dust. "You Holt?" he asked, voice clipped. Caleb nodded. "What's your business?" The stranger reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper. "Notice from the bank. You're behind on payments. They'll take the land by autumn if it ain't settled." Mara's breath caught. She turned to Caleb, but his face was unreadable, carved in stone. The stranger tipped his hat and rode off, leaving only the echo of hooves and the smell of sun-baked leather. That night, the silence returned, not the gentle quiet they'd learned to share, but the heavy kind, filled with worry and things unsaid. Mara watched him by the fire. The lines around his eyes deepened. His hands clenched tight around the paper. "You never told me," she said softly. He didn't look up. "Wasn't your burden to carry." "But I'm here," she whispered. "Aren't we carrying the same load?" His eyes lifted then, full of a weary pride. "This land was my father's. His sweat's in the soil. I'll not see it taken." "And you won't," she said, voice trembling with resolve. "Not while I've got strength left." He stared at her, searching, as though seeing her anew. Then, slow as dawn, he nodded. The next weeks were filled with toil. They worked from first light to last, selling off cattle, hauling grain to town, bartering what little they could spare. Mara sewed for the women of Red Hollow, her fingers raw from needle and thread. The townsfolk whispered still, but now they watched her with something like respect. Even the merchant who once mocked her offered a fair price for her stitching. Through it all, Caleb grew quieter, the weight of the debt pressing on him like stone. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the fear he'd never name. One evening, she found him sitting on the porch, head bowed, hands clasped as if in prayer. She stepped beside him, resting her palm lightly on his shoulder. "We'll find a way," she murmured. For a moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice low and rough as gravel, he answered, "Maybe you're the way." The words lingered between them, fragile and true. But autumn was coming fast, and with it, the reckoning. Autumn crept in slow, the air turning sharp and dry, leaves whispering across the yard like restless ghosts. Each dawn carried a chill that bit through wool and bone, a warning of what waited beyond the horizon. The debt still hung over them like a shadow, no matter how many hours they worked or coins they earned. Mara watched Caleb wear himself thin, his shoulders bowed, his eyes dulled from sleepless nights. He spoke less now, though not from distance. It was the silence of a man measuring time against loss. One evening, as the sun bled low behind the hills, a wagon rolled up the road. Its driver was a woman in a gray bonnet, her face pale with judgment. Mara knew her Mrs. Whitlow, the widow who oversaw the church charity. She stepped down with a look that carried both pity and scorn. "I came to see how you're managing," she said, her voice soft and cold. "There's talk in town, some say you'll be gone before the frost. Others say you've tied yourself to a man who bought you like a mule." Mara stood still, her hands tight at her sides. The words struck deep, though she'd heard worse. Still, something inside her flared, a quiet, fierce pride she'd not felt in years. "He gave me a home," she said, "and I've earned my keep." Mrs. Whitlow's lips tightened. A woman should seek proper redemption in the Lord's house, not on some forsaken ranch. "You could return with me. There's room at the mission." Mara looked past her to where Caleb worked in the field, his figure dark against the dying light. He moved with steady purpose, the way he always did, even when the world pressed hard against him. "Thank you," she said at last, her voice clear, "but I'll stay." The woman left without another word, the wheels of her wagon grinding against the stones. When she was gone, Mara stood in the silence, her heart pounding not from shame but from certainty. She turned toward the field, toward the man who had asked nothing from her but truth. That night, as they sat by the fire, Caleb spoke at last. "I heard what she said." Mara met his gaze. And you chose to stay." His voice was quiet, but beneath it lay a tremor, something between disbelief and gratitude. "I did," she answered, "because this place, it's the first where I felt I might belong." He looked away, staring into the flames. "I never meant to chain you here." "You didn't," she said. "You gave me work. You gave me a chance to stand again." For a long moment, only the fire spoke, crackling soft as breath. Then Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He opened it and poured the contents into his palm, 3 coins, worn smooth from time. "These are the ones I paid that day," he said. "I kept them, maybe out of shame." He looked up, his eyes dark and honest. "They don't mean anything now. You're not mine to own." Mara stared at the coins, the light glinting off their dull surfaces. Slowly, she reached out and closed his fingers around them. "Then let them mean something else. A beginning, not a bargain." He held her gaze, and in it she saw the weariness of years, the quiet ache of a man who had lost too much but still stood. Something shifted between them, no longer 2 strangers bound by circumstance, but 2 souls choosing the same path, come what may. Winter pressed closer. They sold the last of the cattle, bartered wool, took on labor from neighboring farms. Together they scraped enough to send a payment to the bank, enough to buy time, though not relief. Yet in the struggle, their bond deepened. In the cold mornings, Caleb poured her coffee before his own. At dusk, Mara mended his coat while he read softly from a worn Bible, the words falling gentle as snow. One night, as frost crept across the windows, she turned to him and said, "You once told me this land was your father's. Maybe now it can be ours." He looked at her for a long while, then nodded. "Ours," he repeated, as though tasting the word. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but inside the fire burned steady, casting light on 2 figures who had found, through hardship and grace, something that could not be bought, only chosen. Winter came hard that year. The wind swept across the plains like a blade, stripping the trees bare and pressing frost into every crack of the old house. The roof groaned under snow, and the air stung the skin raw. Yet inside, a quiet warmth grew, born not of the fire alone, but of 2 hearts that had learned to weather more than storms. Mara worked from dawn to dark, her hands red from cold water, her breath clouding the air. She stitched quilts from old fabric, baked what bread she could from meager stores, and tended the hearth as though tending a fragile hope. Caleb labored through the drifts, breaking ice in the troughs, hauling wood, his coat patched by her own careful hands. Neither spoke much, but the silence had changed. It no longer weighed heavy. It was shared, like a blanket stretched between them. Sometimes, in the long evenings, they sat by the fire, and Caleb would tell stories of the land, how his father had built the house board by board, how the first cattle were driven through snow deeper than a man's knees, how the stars once guided him home when all trails were lost. Mara listened, her eyes on the flames, the rhythm of his voice grounding her like a root in the frozen ground. One night, as the firelight flickered low, she asked, "What will you do when the thaw comes?" He looked into the hearth, then back at her. "Plant again," he said. "Even if the ground's still tired, it's what we do, we try again." She nodded slowly. "Then, I'll plant beside you." The words came soft, but they settled deep. Caleb's eyes lingered on her, and in their steady light, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding older than vows. The days crawled on, each one a battle against cold and hunger. The pantry thinned, the woodpile shrank. More than once, Mara woke in the dark to find him sitting by the window, staring out across the white land, his face carved with worry. The bank's notice still hung over them like a storm not yet spent. She wanted to ease his burden, to say that the land mattered less than the life they'd built upon it, but she knew he carried ghosts she could not silence. Then, one morning, as the sun rose pale and weak, a knock sounded at the door. Caleb opened it to find a rider from town, a young boy with a letter sealed in rough wax. Caleb read it in silence, his jaw tightening. Mara waited, her heart thudding. At last, he handed it to her. It was from the bank, the final notice. They had until spring's end to pay the debt, or the land would be taken. She folded the paper slowly, her fingers trembling. "We've done all we can," she whispered. "There's nothing left to sell." Caleb's voice was low, almost bitter. "Then it ends where it began, empty hands and hard ground." But Mara stepped closer, her eyes fierce despite the fear. "No, it doesn't end. We've worked this land, we've bled for it. It's more than dirt, it's what we've become." He looked at her, searching, as though seeing strength where once he'd seen sorrow. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, with a breath that seemed to steady him, he said, "Maybe there's one thing left." The next day, they hitched the wagon and rode into town. The streets were hushed under snow, the church bell tolling faintly in the wind. They stopped before the general store, where a small crowd had gathered for the monthly market. Caleb stepped down, his hand brushing Mara's as he turned to her. "Stay close," he murmured. Inside, he spoke with the merchant, trading the last of his cattle for grain and coin. Mara stood beside him, head held high despite the stares. When the merchant offered less than fair, Caleb's voice cut through the air, calm but unyielding. "You know the worth," he said, "and I won't take less." Something in his tone silenced the room. The man nodded, counting the coins with a grim respect. It wasn't enough to clear the debt, but it was something, and in that moment, Mara understood. They would not bow. As they stepped back into the cold, Caleb took her hand openly, without shame. The gesture was simple, but it burned like sunlight in winter. She met his eyes and saw no pity, no possession, only a quiet vow. Whatever came when the thaw broke, they would face it together. When spring finally came, it broke the land open like a long-held breath. The snow melted into dark rivulets, carving veins through the fields. The air smelled of mud and promise, and though the debt still loomed, hope stirred with the thaw. Caleb and Mara worked side by side, turning the soil with blistered hands, planting rows of wheat and corn, though they knew the yield might not come in time. Each seed they pressed into the ground felt like a prayer, silent, desperate, stubborn. The town still whispered, though less cruelly now. Folks had watched through winter's bite as the two held on when others would have left. Some began to nod in quiet respect when they passed through Red Hollow, their gazes softening. A few even offered help, a sack of seed, a day's labor, a kind word. Pride made Caleb slow to accept, but Mara reminded him that a hand extended was not always charity. Sometimes it was fellowship. Evenings were gentler now. They ate by the fire, their laughter cautious but real. Sometimes, when the work was done and the stars came bright, Caleb took down the old fiddle his father once played. The notes were rough at first, halting, but soon they filled the small house with a warmth that no coin could buy. Mara would sit by the hearth, mending a shirt or simply listening, her heart swelling with something she dared not yet name. Still, fear lingered at the edges of her mind, fear of losing the land, of returning to the emptiness she'd once known. She dreamt sometimes of the auction, of the crowd's cold eyes, the sound of the gavel striking like a final heartbeat. But when she woke in the dark, Caleb was there beside her, his breath steady, his presence anchoring her to the world. Each time she whispered a silent vow. She would not be lost again. By mid-season, word came that the harvest might fetch a good price if it survived drought, if the bank would wait. Caleb rode to town one morning to plead for more time. Mara watched him ride off, the dust trailing behind like a ribbon of fate. She waited all day, the hours long and restless. When he returned near dusk, his shoulders sagged with weariness, but there was something steady in his eyes. "They'll give us until harvest," he said. "No more." Mara nodded, relief and dread twisting together in her chest. "Then we make it count." And they did. They worked until their hands bled, until the sun burned their skin dark and their backs ached beyond words. Neighbors came to lend strength, men with plows, women with baskets. The field grew green under their care, the first shoots pushing through the soil like defiance. Each dawn brought new labor, each dusk a quiet gratitude that the day had held. One evening, as the sky blushed gold, Caleb found Mara standing at the edge of the field. She was barefoot in the damp earth, her dress hemmed with mud, her eyes lifted to the horizon. He came beside her, wordless, and they stood together watching the wind move through the wheat like a tide. After a long while, she spoke. "I used to think I was buried with him with my first life, my first name, but maybe I was just waiting to be planted." Caleb turned to her, his gaze steady and soft. "You've grown stronger than the land," he said, "stronger than me." She smiled faintly, tears glinting in the fading light. "No," she whispered, "just rooted now. At last." He reached for her hand not as a claim but as a joining. She took it, their fingers lacing together like threads in the same cloth. In that moment, the field seemed to breathe around them. the earth alive with promise. Whatever came, drought, debt, or the harsh hand of fate, they would face it as one. The world had taken much from them, but in the quiet mercy of a spring evening, it had also given something back. Summer ripened across the plains, the wheat turning from green to gold beneath the relentless Sunday. The air shimmered with heat, the scent of dry grass and dust heavy on the wind. Each day, Mara and Caleb rose before dawn, their shadows long across the fields, working in rhythm with the earth's slow breathing. The harvest grew full and strong, thick heads of grain bending low, heavy with promise. For the first time in years, the land seemed to remember kindness. The rains had come steady, not cruel. The cattle grew fat on the sweet grass that returned after so many barren seasons. Still, they labored without rest, knowing one storm or one stray spark could undo everything. The bank's letter lay folded in the drawer, a quiet reminder that survival had a deadline. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, the sun sinking in a blaze of red behind the hills. Caleb would pour them each a cup of coffee, rough and bitter, and they'd watch the shadows stretch across the land. It had become a ritual, one born not of need, but of belonging. One such evening, Mara broke the silence. When the harvest is sold and the debt is gone, what then? Caleb's gaze lingered on the horizon before turning to her. Then the land is ours again. Not the bank's, not anyone's. Ours to keep, or to build something new. She hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. And me? Where do I fit in that? He looked at her, really looked, his eyes steady as the earth beneath their boots. You're the reason I still believe there's something worth building. Her breath caught, and for a moment the air between them felt alive, humming with all the words neither had dared to speak. She wanted to tell him that somewhere along the way, this place had become more than shelter, that in his quiet strength she had found a new beginning. But the words stayed in her chest, too tender to touch. The days stretched long and hot. When the wheat finally stood ready, they worked from dawn to dusk, scythes slicing through the fields, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Neighbors came to help, drawn by gratitude and respect. Together they filled wagon after wagon, the air thick with the scent of grain and sweat. At last, the work was done. The fields lay bare, the granaries full. Caleb hitched the wagon and rode to town with the harvest, Mara by his side. The sun burned high overhead as they crossed the dusty road into Red Hollow, their wagon heavy with the fruit of their labor. At the mill, the merchant weighed the grain, counted the sacks, and tallied the sum. When he handed Caleb the payment, the coins clinked together, rich and solid, more than enough to settle the debt. Caleb turned to Mara, his voice low. It's done. They rode to the bank together. Inside, the air was cool and still, the walls lined with ledgers and locked drawers. The banker, a gray man with thin lips, looked up as they entered. Caleb placed the pouch on the counter. For the land, he said simply. The man counted each coin, then stamped a paper and slid it across the desk. Paid in full, he said. Caleb took the paper, but it was Mara who reached out, touching it with trembling fingers. For so long, her life had been marked by what was taken: her husband, her home, her name. But here, at last, was something given back. They stepped outside into the glare of the Sunday. The dust swirled around their boots, but the weight had lifted. Caleb turned to her, holding the paper out like an offering. It's ours now, he said, yours as much as mine. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow but release. Then let's build something that lasts. He nodded, and in his gaze was a quiet vow, a promise not born of purchase or pity, but of choice freely made. That night, beneath a sky thick with stars, they stood hand in hand before the house. The fields spread wide and golden around them. The wind moved through the grass like a hymn, carrying the scent of harvest and hope. Mara leaned into him, her voice soft as a prayer. Once, I was sold for $3. Now, I've been given a life no price could buy. Caleb's hand tightened around hers. You were never for sale, he said. You were waiting to be found. And in the hush of that summer night, with the land whispering its blessings, they knew the hardest days were behind them and the truest days still to come.